for coming. We are really happy to have you. I would work here at the European Parliament Liaison Office, and I really wanted to give a warm welcome on behalf of the office here at Europe House. We are sharing the building together with the EU delegation and the European Parliament Liaison Office. And we are really, really grateful and happy to work with you, with the Ukrainian Institute. And this is already our third joint event. So we are, I always say we have to work with you despite the circumstances which brought us together. But this is a very, very important work what you are doing, and we are really happy to be part of it and give support for you. So all in all, it's not really my role to speak today, so really I would like to give a warm welcome to our special guests and speakers, and actually I would just wish you enjoy the evening and pass on the floor to Maria. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, and big thanks to the European Parliament Liaison Office here in London for hosting us this evening. I'm Maria Montague, I'm the Deputy Director of the Ukrainian Institute London. And I'd just like to say a couple of words about the Institute. We're an independent charity dedicated to championing Ukrainian culture and shaping the conversation about Ukraine here in the UK and beyond. And we're really, really pleased to have this important conversation this evening on Russian propaganda, which has of course been a topic discussed by many experts over the past year, including in relation to proving Russian genocidal intent towards Ukrainians, given the absolutely horrific messaging in Russian propaganda. But this evening we're also really looking forward to not only analysing the narratives in Russian propaganda, but also the reasons why they resonate so strongly among so many Russians. And we're really grateful to Jaroslava Barbieri for moderating this discussion this evening. Jaroslava is a Ukrainian-Italian researcher and teaching fellow at the University of Birmingham. She is an expert on Ukrainian politics, Russian foreign policy, and disinformation. And as part of her doctoral research, she is looking at the steps taken by Russia between 2014 and 2021 in the occupied territories of Ukraine and Moldova to integrate those territories into the Russian federal system, including looking at the so-called patriotic education programs as a means of indoctrination. So thank you very much, Jaroslava, for moderating our discussion. I'll hand over to you now to introduce our event properly and the topic of our discussion, and introduce our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on?
Thank you.
Doesn't.
This one's on.
All right. Welcome everyone to today's event. Entitled Russian Propaganda Manipulating or Manifesting Russians' Views on Ukraine. And as you understand from the title, one of our objectives was to challenge a very simplistic approach to the notion of propaganda as mere indoctrination or brainwashing. And we thought that one of the problematic aspects with this connotation is that, well, A, it overlooks multiple complementary functions that Russian propaganda actually has, and B, on a deeper level, it reinforces a certain image of Russian society as mere victim of a top-down imposed worldview from the state, and as a result, it sort of distracts us from more uncomfortable but urgent conversations about collective responsibility, and as you probably have seen widely, that ends up trapping us into like a framework that's just Russia's war, and so it doesn't allow us to engage with more urgent and deeper conversations. And so we thought it would be just great to approach these topics with two fantastic speakers. So here close to me we have Francis Scarr, who joined BBC Monitoring in 2018, where he's currently a specialist on Russian domestic media. Previously, for 4 years, right until the start of the invasion, he actually lived in Russia. And she's been interviewed by many major media outlets, including the New York Times and the Guardian, and has also written for the Telegraph. And then we have Dr. Jade McGlynn, who is an author of Russia's War, is the book that has just recently come out. I have a copy in my backpack upstairs, and also another upcoming book, Memory Makers, and she's also co-editors of 2 volumes on memory politics and Eastern European history. And she is currently a Leverhulme Research Fellow based at the War Studies Department, King's College London, and she's also a non-resident senior researcher at the Centre for International Strategic Studies. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and I'm looking forward. So maybe let's start with Francis. So to just set the context a bit for our conversation, we know that dehumanizing language towards Ukrainians and other rhetorics around dismissing the existence of a Ukrainian state, which is dismissed as just a mere artifice, are really not new in Russian domestic discourse. But arguably what is actually new is the more systematic use of openly genocidal rhetoric towards Ukrainians since the start of the invasion. So on the basis of this premise, and just you've worked extensively on observing Russian domestic media, so my question to you is, what are some of the most persistent narratives that you've observed, and particularly if we just focus on the past 14 months, have you noticed perhaps any noteworthy shifts, rhetorical shifts?
Okay, well, I'll start by saying that as you correctly pointed out, this kind of language didn't start on the 24th of February last year. In the kind of form that we see it today, it goes back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea by Russia, following kind of Ukraine's turn towards Europe, and this desire to portray Ukraine as a sort of a state that doesn't really have the right to exist by itself. And the kind of language that's used to voice this narrative on Russian TV, it starts from the choice of individual words. So even now how we're seeing the Ukrainian army described on Russian state TV, they're not referred to just as soldiers or as troops. All these words are used like militants, terrorists, Nazis, neo-Nazis, Ukro-Nazis, and this is the way that the Ukrainian army is described on a daily basis, on an hourly basis on Russian TV. There's also things like the acronym in Russian for the Ukrainian armed forces is VSU, and Russian TV for some time was calling the Ukrainian armed forces the VFU, which stands for like Armed Formations of Ukraine, which so the average Russian would evoke the language that was used to describe Syrian rebels that Russians were fighting against after being asked to sort of help Assad out or go in there on their own accord. So really setting this tone that these people, they're not even the representatives of an army fighting for a legitimate state, they're just kind of terrorists in a sense. And I think you mentioned turning points. The most interesting turning point, I think, came fairly early on in the war, and that was when the Russian state TV, Russian propaganda, was forced to recognize that actually the Ukrainians were putting up a fight, and they were the Russian army was pushed back from around Kiev and Chernihiv in the north, and all of this triumphalist rhetoric we saw in the first few days suddenly came ground to a halt. I remember one TV host, Olga Skabeeva, she's very prominent, saying, I think it was on day 3 or 4 of the war, saying that the Ukrainians in Kharkiv region are greeting our soldiers with flowers, and their only complaint is that we took so long to rescue them. And I think, not long after that, it became fairly clear that actually the vast majority of Ukrainians didn't want to have anything to do with Russia, and the fact that they spoke Russian as a sort of first language for some Ukrainians had absolutely no bearing on their sense of pride about their nationhood. And I mean, I think I don't know how many of you here are familiar with the kind of stuff that is on Russian TV on a daily basis, but just to give you an overall kind of picture of it, that they don't really talk about what's going on inside Russia. You turn on these political talk shows every day, and they're fixated on Ukraine, and they have been for years. And they're talking about they'll say that the Ukrainian army, they'll begin the show by saying that the Ukrainian army has been shelling Donetsk over the weekend and has killed 10 innocent children or something like that. And there won't be any sort of mention of what they're doing to Ukrainians, and let alone any kind of mention of social or economic problems within Russia. You'd think that political talk show, if there was a political talk show on British TV or on American TV or German or French or whatever, they would be discussing problems within that country. On Russian TV, they don't do that. They only talk about Russia when President Putin has given some large speech, or some governor has opened a large infrastructure project, a bridge or a university or something like that. And so there's this complete fixation on what's going on next door and also in the West, which we'll come to later. So really, I suppose I just wanted to stress how the Russian state media is really just its existence almost is formed by this constant undermining of Ukrainian statehood on a daily basis. And these shows, they last for 3 hours, some of them, each one, and they dominate the TV schedules. They don't really have Monday to Friday any kind of innocuous cookery programs or like property or anything like that. It's just not there. It's just political kind of propaganda non-stop.
I mean, this is quite a strong feature about Russian domestic media that you outlined. I know, Jade, in your research, beyond Russian state media, you've also focused on studying the digital landscape, which arguably for Western audiences is even more opaque than Russian state media. Just based also on what Francis has just told us, what kind of conversations have you observed happening on these online platforms, particular Telegram channels, and how, in your views, are Russian online users engaging with these conversations?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and thank you for hosting me. Thank you to the Ukrainian Institute rather for hosting me. In terms of Telegram, I think one of the reasons why I was so interested in analysing Telegram is because it's not censored. That's not to say it's not monitored, it definitely is. And that's not to say that many of those who are posting on the channels are not aware that there is a very clear boundary within which they should function. But I think one of the difficult aspects, or sometimes one of the assumptions that happens with Russian media is this idea that, there is this top-down exact phrasing or, strict line that has to be followed, and it's not really like that. It's more, these are some sort of motifs or tropes that you can throw out, and for example, this is like Stalingrad, or this is like the Pechenegs, or whatever. And these are the sort of boundaries within which you can act. And then it's actually quite a competitive space in which people sort of compete. I mean, a lot of the Russian media is still reliant on advertising revenues, for example. So they need to appeal. There needs to be this entertainment. And a lot of the shows that Francis was just talking about, they're known as agitainment because they're propaganda, but they're also entertaining. I mean, in a weird way. And I think that if we look inside our heart of hearts, we might be able to find some examples in Western media of similar types of shows, though not to that level of intensity, that's for sure. So there's that aspect. But with Telegram, the interesting element was, of course, that then I could also look at some opposition channels as well. And I looked at 75,000 posts that I coded by theme and virality across different channels. So some of them were war correspondents, and they mainly just focused on Ukrainians as evil, Ukrainians as cruel, Ukrainians as Nazis, and Russian military might. By comparison, some of the programs that were either state or people like Simonyan and Solovyov, they had a lot more focus on the West compared to the military correspondents. So it's also interesting that you have this difference. And I guess, that's because people were following the military correspondents. Well, there could be two aspects. One could be that the military correspondents understood they weren't really fighting the West because they were in Ukraine. Or the other aspect could just be to do with sort of management. And I think we'll come to this later in terms of how the Kremlin sort of manages audiences, because one of the interesting elements that comes through in my research, since 2014 on Kremlin narratives around sort of Ukraine, but also around sort of trying to formulate a broader worldview or a broader way of understanding the world within Russian society, is that this is something that's not necessarily about. This is something that has resonance, and they're building on that resonance, but that doesn't mean it's always about persuasion. Sometimes it's just, it works in different parts of the audience in different ways, and I think for too long we've had a very sort of binary focus that you either have people either love Navalny or people either love Putin, and they're either for the war or against the war, and actually that's just not how human beings work, that's not how communications work, and that's certainly not how Russian communications work.
Well, based on what you just said, so how does communications work in Russia when we look at these domestic programs? If we just focus on domestic audiences, so what are they trying to say? Before you were informally saying also, Francis, how an interesting turning shift was how traditionally there was always this liberal speaker as a punch bag, and sort of with the start of the invasion they sort of removed this communications function. So can you at least help us in the audience understand what kind of communications objectives these shows are trying to implement?
Shall I go?
I can just say a couple of things quickly. So, yeah, as Jade alluded to, these shows, they're quite entertaining visually to watch, and a huge amount of money is poured into Russian state TV. People have often, I post these clips on Twitter, some of you may be familiar with, and some people comment that they almost look like game shows, that you have these people standing around in a circle with lecterns and like sort of plenty of cameras in the studio, all from different kinds of angles, on sweeping across the studio, and various lights and a big screen behind, and even like the reports of Ukrainian soldiers in Ukraine are sort of set against this sinister drum roll often, and one observation that is often made with Russian state TV is that because these programs are so long, it's unlikely that someone is actually sitting there every day and watching 3 hours of propaganda. And
just you.
Well, yeah, just me, a few other unlucky people. And in fact, it's almost just designed to be there in the background. So you're just you're a Russian housewife, or you're a bored security guard sitting in your cabin, or a pensioner, and it's just there in the corner, and occasionally you just hear someone shouting about Ukrainian Nazis and Banderites, and it makes this emotional impression on you. And it's not really designed to be consumed with any kind of level of logic or reason. It's an appeal to the emotions, and that's why we see so much this sense of victimhood, which I know we can go into more deeply, that it's really appealing to the sense that the world is against Russia, and Ukraine is being used by the West against Russia, and that Russia is only ever responding to aggression. And that puts you in a much easier psychological position if you're thinking that, for a start, many Russians are obviously, if they see these allegations of war crimes, they're kind of turning a blind eye to it. But even if they are absorbing them and sort of acknowledging them, they're kind of thinking, well, but we're only responding to what they've done to our children in Donbass, which is even worse. And so you're in this situation where you're constantly seeing yourself as the victim, and I think that also applies to how the way they demonize Ukrainians, because we don't see, some people say to me, oh, well, this is like, under Hitler, the way that the Jews were demonized in Nazi Germany. It's a bit different to that, because no one on Russian TV is calling Ukrainians like Untermensch. They're referring to them as sort of people who are so sinister and ghoulish that really they are the villains, and Russians are the heroes defending defending themselves from the Ukrainians. They're not saying Ukrainians are somehow. They're saying that they're inferior in the sense that their state doesn't have a right to exist, but they're not saying they're inferior on the level of kind of humanity. So constantly this sense that Russians are defending themselves rather than attacking is something you really see come through every day.
Jade, what do you think?
Thank you. Broadly, I agree. I think the way that I understand the media spaces working, I suppose, is just more about nudging effect, in the sense that they want to make the active, they're not trying to make everybody believe a certain way. In fact, it's actually not helpful for the Kremlin to have, really active militant supporters, because they're quite difficult to control. And we saw that in 2014, where almost the narrative, I appreciate I'm going ahead to a question that might come up later, but in 2014 the narrative was almost too effective and they had to tone it down a little bit, and it would appear that they've learnt from that experience. So they tried to make the active opposition apathetic. So they sort of think there's no point, there's nothing I can do. They tried to make the apathetic, people who are a bit apathetic, into sort of, loyal neutrals, like my country, right or wrong. Maybe I don't agree with what, I don't know what's true, I don't know what's not true, but I've only got one country, so I'm going to support them. I'm not saying that these are necessarily always genuinely held, but these are the sort of attitudinal groups that come up in terms of justifications and in terms of what the narratives appear to be trying to appeal to. And then you have people who are sort of supporters, but they're kind of, they support it because it resonates, but they're not necessarily going to sign up and sacrifice themselves. And then you have the more hardcore active supporter group, where, I mean, the Kremlin obviously needs them in some ways, particularly, of course, around mobilizational age men, but also in other ways they can cause a lot of problems, because if they actually believe in the purpose of the war, then they're going to start asking questions. And we've seen that with the so-called turbo patriot bloggers, who've been very critical of the war. And in general, I mean, that has been allowed to an extent because it's helpful. I mean, it's much easier to be an authoritarian leader if you're popular, because you don't have to make sure that your security services have got loads of arms that then they could maybe turn against you. And it's also just very expensive to be an unpopular authoritarian leader. And actually it's very helpful to have these kind of pseudo-democratic institutions, I suppose, if on the symbolic level, what Francis referred to as that liberal punching bag on the television channels, because it allows, first of all, it allows for a little bit of, I suppose, releases some pressure, releases some of the steam from the debate, but it also gives a sense of, we know that the presidential administration is obsessed with polls, we know it has its own polls. Putin is clearly not a man of the people who goes out and sort of just hangs out with people, and everything he kind of understands tends to come to him through files and papers. And so it's been seen as important to have this kind of, I suppose, what we might call policy critical rather than leadership critical voices, but clearly that's gone too far at points, because we've seen different crackdowns, different threats, and I mean, I think that's definitely an interesting space to watch, and the extent to which that's becoming now, that might become the opposition, is something to look at. And just as a final point, I want to come back to something that also Francis alluded to, which is, and I think something that we often forget about when we talk about media, which is the role of popular culture. So since 2014, actually since 2012, we have seen incredible investments. If we look at the state patriotic the state program of patriotic education, which I know Jaroslava is interested in terms of the money that's been funded into these World War II films, where Ukrainians are always basically yokels, or they're Nazis, or they're traitors. And it's not that the Ukrainians are necessarily the main character always, but if there is a Ukrainian, they will be one of these three. And they will speak Russian, but they'll use the odd word from Ukrainian. And I know, Francis, you've spoken about this before, the use of Ukrainian words as a way to mock Ukrainian on Russian television. It's just a particularly ghoulish technique. For example, the insistence on referring to Ukraine sarcastically as nezalezhna, so independent. And you see this sort of aspect, this idea of this is a dialect, just this constant sort of drumming in, but it doesn't just happen on the news media, it also is happening in films that you watch, in places where you're maybe not expecting propaganda, because I think most people, if they tune into the sorts of programs that we've been discussing, they will be expecting some propaganda. Whereas if you're just watching a film or a history documentary that to you looks like it's been funded by various sort of organisations that you don't realise are state-run, then that's kind of reinforcing all these narratives. I think that's the element that also needs to be considered alongside, is that there has been this massive campaign in popular culture to demonise Ukrainians and to demonise sort of even the idea of Ukraine, to paint Ukraine as the concept of Ukraine, like Ukrainianness, as a weapon that the West has created against Russia, to sort of paraphrase Putin's essay. I think that's an important element, to see them side by side.
No, I mean, thank you. This is exactly the kind of conversation I wanted to have, like this more nuanced approach to the understanding of how Russian propaganda operates domestically. But then my follow-up question is, based on everything that we've discussed about domestic context, to what extent does it apply to Russian propaganda aimed at Western audiences?
Well, I think they operate in a different kind of way, because the things that you hear on Russian TV, domestic TV every day, if you were to hear that on RT, you wouldn't expect to hear it. The kind of rampant homophobia and use of offensive terms. I think Russian propaganda is quite effective, not so much, not just in the West, but in other places around the world, in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East, by really appealing to pre-existing prejudices. And so often it won't necessarily be talking up Russia's achievements. It will just be slating the US, for example. And there are plenty of parts of the world where that's a narrative that really is quite well received. So I think with the West, there's definitely a sense they know who their audience are. People on the fringes of the political spectrum who, in Britain, for example, who are against NATO, the kind of people who would identify as anti-imperialists. That's the word that they often go to, and people who sort of see this world in almost zero-sum terms. That if their own governments are acting belligerently in some way, that means that Russia's government must be justified in how it's acting because it's on the other side. And it's perfectly reasonable to criticize your own government and criticize the Russian government at the same time. You don't have to support the Russian government just because you don't like what your own government's doing. So I think this is something that probably Jade is better equipped to answer, given that I'm knee-deep in domestic propaganda the whole time, but I don't. No,
but basically you also mentioned Russian propaganda narratives aimed at global south audiences, which is an angle that we tend to forget. We tend to just think about Russian propaganda perhaps domestically and then towards Western audiences, but I know that you, Jade, have written about what you call memory diplomacy of Russian state actors towards global south countries, and in this rhetorical landscape we often hear basically narratives that try to bring back positive memories of Soviet support to African wars of independence. So my question to you is, how effective do you think that Russian narratives are towards global south audiences? And another thing I'm interested in is, what must Ukraine do then to communicate to these audiences that Ukraine's fight is also an anti-colonial war in many respects?
Big questions. In terms of the effectiveness question, I always slightly panic with this one, because there's been sort of 100 years of sort of political communications existing as a field, and to date nobody's quite been able to prove the sort of the causation element. But I think in a way I can go back to what Francis spoke about in terms of the resonance. So the Kremlin is not obviously creating these narratives. It's not created this sense of anger at Western imperialism. That anger is there. That is a righteous anger. And the Kremlin is just able to tap into that resonance and to use some of its power, for its own uses. So I think that's important, is appreciating that, as well, the global south is quite a large term. There are many African countries that have sided with Ukraine, for example, Kenya being the example that immediately comes to mind. But I think the question of sort of memory diplomacy and that use of history, everybody uses history, everybody just uses the past to make sense of new things. And it's effective in terms of narratives are about meaning making. We need to kind of look back to the past to have some sort of way to prism through which to understand what's happening now. And it's quite natural, of course, that a lot of that history, particularly around war, is going to have that emotional resonance. And the Kremlin has been very adept at using that at home, and increasingly it's starting to try to do it abroad. And bluntly, that's what I'm supposed to be researching now if I didn't keep getting lured away by the hate speech of Kiselyov or whoever. And my answers on this aren't going to be as accomplished because this is a research project that's ongoing. But I do have some thoughts in terms of how Ukraine might better tackle it. And I think one of them is just being more active. So I read a really fascinating study that said that, within the first month of the war, of the full-scale invasion, the full-scale war beginning in 2022, there was something like 138 op-eds written by people who were connected to Russia, essentially pro-Russian, and only one, and this is in the sub-Saharan space, only one written but from a pro-Ukrainian or a Ukrainian-connected thing. So I think just being active, because ultimately, we see, narratives have resonance if they do this, that, and that. But also you need to hear them. You need to hear them for them to have some resonance. And the other aspect would maybe be a bit more specific, which is I don't think that the whole European values thing goes down that well, for obvious reasons. So, perhaps don't use that one.
Well, we look forward to hearing about the results from that research project you're working on. I'm glad you mentioned emotional resonance, because actually that was part of my next question. So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there seems to be a bit this tendency to want to see Russians as just passive victims of this top-down imposed state propaganda. But I think that in your book you're actually challenging this notion. And I just want to quote a brief paragraph in which you say that these narratives are often court creations selected for their resonance rather than artifice imposed from above. Putin doesn't shape Russians' views on foreign policy or Ukraine so much as he articulates them. The Kremlin has used smokes and mirrors to encourage Russians to support the so-called special military operation, but the Russian people are co-authors of this deception. So my next question to you is, what are some of those national myths that underpin many of those narratives that have been mobilized to justify the so-called special military operation? Why do they resonate among so many Russians? And in answering this question, if you could perhaps elaborate a bit more on this idea of the Russian people as co-authors of these narratives.
I think that's what I wanted to do in the book, was not just to ask, of course it's important to ask what is the TV or what are the media telling people, but it's also important to ask, well, why are they tuning in? Why did they tune in? Because a lot of the programs that Francis has been speaking about, a lot of them were launched in 2014 and they were really, really popular. And that's why they were sort of developed then. In fact, Solovyov originally had a program called The Jewel, and it was cancelled not because of bad ratings, but because they needed to calm down the narrative, because everybody was expecting that they would then annex the Donbass in 2014, which the Kremlin didn't want to do at that time. So these programs, they were brought back because they were popular. They weren't something that was imposed on people, and I think that's important to understand. Now, what do I mean when I say co-authors? Well, firstly, going back to that resonance point, but also if we look at global value surveys, we can see that Russians express a particularly aggressive form of patriotism compared to other countries. So they score the highest throughout the 1990s before Putin is in power, in terms of, yes, my country, right or wrong, it doesn't matter if my country should pursue its interests even if it hurts other countries. So we see that this level is much what's the highest of any country surveyed throughout the 1990s. If we look at surveys in terms of views on Soviet nostalgia, on views of Stalin, we actually see that as a rule, Putin tends to be on the more moderate end. If we look at his statements, and there's a deliberate plan, or a deliberate positioning, there we are, of of the Kremlin as that more moderate sense, as in, well, look at these crazy guys. Imagine what would happen if you didn't have the sane people like us. And I think that's something that isn't always understood in Western perceptions of the media. So that's partly what I mean. But also, again, to come back to the advertising revenue point, to come back to the Telegram. Telegram is not censored, and yet 18 of the 20 most popular political channels are virulently pro-war, and there are 50 million regular users of Telegram. So we need to ask these questions. Why does it appeal? I can't give you the exact reasons of why it appeals. I don't think anybody can, because we're talking about individuals and human beings. There are different reasons that go into the socio-cultural, past, bits of history, bits of, cults of perpetrators that exist within Russia that do not exist in other countries that once were part of the Soviet Union or that once were part of the sort of communist bloc. There are lots and lots of different reasons, but I think so. This with the co-authors, I'm not trying to assign some sort of collective guilt. That's not my purpose. I'm genuinely trying to understand why these narratives appeal, and what they speak to, and sort of where that hunger comes from. Because of course Putin and the media and those who are competing and have decided to kind of sell their soul to these awful narratives, of course they are completely to blame, and they are feeding that hunger with just the worst, most awful, terrible for you kind of food. But at some point we need to think, okay, but what might be something better to feed it with? Because for me, I think, of course, this is a war against Ukraine, against Ukrainians, to destroy Ukraine, but ultimately the issue won't be solved in Ukraine. It exists in Russia's understanding of itself, its insecurities within its socio-political imagination and understanding of itself. So at some point, somebody's going to have to come up, and Russians are going to have to come up with it. It needs to come from inside Russia, a better idea of what Russia is that doesn't depend on subjugating Ukraine.
And among these many myths that are being mobilized also to trigger certain types of emotions around also collective victimization, we know that the myth of the Great Patriotic War is arguably the most prominent one in the context of modern Russian state building, but also nation building. So what role does it exactly play in this Russia's sense of messianism, but also its aggressive foreign policy? Going back to the point on, the use of history for political purposes.
Well, I mean, I can say I spent a year studying in Russia and then 4 years working there. And of course, Russia now positions itself as an Orthodox Christian state. But the impression you get from living there, the real religion is this cult of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War, as they call it. And it's absolutely everywhere. And it's something that people hold in reverence, this sort of defence of their country, and there's no space for any kind of criticism of it. So it's just this kind of figure of 27 million dead is constantly repeated, even though that of course includes people from Ukraine and other former Soviet republics. And I remember speaking actually to this is completely anecdotal, but this family I spent a lot of time with when I was a student there. This guy, sort of my parents' age, I used to go and visit him at the weekends at his dacha, and I would just speak Russian to his family because they didn't speak any English. And over the phone to me, a couple of days after Russian troops invaded Ukraine, he said, "Oh well, we had to do it because we couldn't make the same mistake that Stalin made in 1941. We couldn't let the Ukrainians invade with Western support like the Germans invaded. We had to preemptively sort of stop it." And this, I mean, it sounds like complete nonsense, but it's something that genuinely many Russians probably believed. And this sense of victimhood that they feel is, I mean, ultimately, I think the Second World War is the main source of that. Jade will be able to talk about other sources and be able to talk about that in more detail. But it's this kind of constant thing that accompanies many Russians throughout their lives, I think, that because of what happened between 1941 and 1945, that they can never sort of be in the wrong, that so much wrong has been done to them that anything that they now do is a reaction to that and is their way of responding to aggression from outside.
Thank you. I agree. I think to pick up on that point, I would say you can't separate the Great Patriotic War cult in its current guise from the war against Ukraine as it started in 2014. They've consistently been merged, and the way I first got interested in this whole topic of Russian propaganda around Ukraine and around Russian national identity is just watching the TV in 2014 in Moscow and becoming quite obsessed by the level of just the detail of the historical analogy that really doesn't come across if you just say, oh, okay, this is about Ukrainians being Nazis. It's not. It's about, in terms of their presentation, it's about really detailed stories of veterans of World War II and how their sons were tortured by Banderivtsi, and then how this woman now thinks that Banderivtsi have returned, and the Russian soldiers are going to sort of save them just like their ancestors in the Red Army did. So there's this real sense of history being repeated, but also that this is a memory war turned real, that this is a war to make sure that Russians can remember the Great Patriotic War. And you see this a lot actually last year in some of the newly occupied territories where Russians would say things like, oh, Kherson can now have its Victory Day parade, and it hasn't had one. But I mean, it had. You could just go on YouTube and see that they'd had one the year before. But it's a core part of the idea that that this is an attack, that the attack on Ukraine, that the West is using Ukraine to attack Russian identity. And one of the ways that this is sort of proven and demonstrated is through the idea that there is an attack on the Great Patriotic War. Now, what does that actually sort of mean? Well, because the Great Patriotic War obviously isn't World War II, but also it's very de-ideologized, like the entire sort of memory of the communist period, which is essentially just remembered as, this is a period when we were a great power. And that is the historical essence of Russia, continued through that, and we were a great power, and that was wonderful. But if you de-ideologize it, essentially what you end up with is, okay, what is the great victory? It's a victory not over fascism, it's a victory for Russian great power. And when you hear about, one of Putin's favorite phrases is, oh, the return of the post-Yalta settlement, or, the West have tried to overturn the post-Yalta settlement, and we are sort of restoring it. What does that mean? Well, it means Russia has a right to a sphere of influence. Russia has the right to control certain countries, and that's really what the understanding is in terms of the moral right that they have been given by the great victory of 1945. That's also one of the reasons why absolutely everybody can be a Nazi, because essentially you're a Nazi if you just don't agree with Russia's view of the world in terms of what power it should have. And then just as a final point, it's interesting what you said about your friend from the dacha, because I had a conversation with Fyodor Lukyanov on this exact topic, and he said that he calls it 22nd of June syndrome. In reference to the invasion and this idea that, oh, we had to do it first. But I mean, he was very cynical. He said that it does play a role in policy making, but he was quite cynical about it. But I don't know. I feel like he probably knows more than me about what goes on in the Kremlin, but he may not always be forthcoming about it.
Yeah, and just to share another example of the power of this myth, even when you look at the patriotic education programs in the occupied territories in eastern Ukraine in 2014, there are lots of parallels also with Transnistria, and you see basically this organization, these so-called lessons in courage, and so you have these school kids that sit there and they make them watch these films about the Great Patriotic War, they make them meet with veterans, and even the vocabulary that they use, it's about drawing historical parallels, say, between the Great Patriotic War and then the war in Donbass was portrayed as a direct continuation of that same struggle. So it's just the ubiquity of this myth is just overwhelming. Just briefly, I wanted to move back to one point that Jake mentioned before, when you mentioned that eventually this is something that Russians will have to solve at home. So this might be a controversial point, but drawing also parallels with Germany's defeat in World War II and how that provided a window for a completely different future for Germany, is a decisive military defeat of Russia in Ukraine what it takes for Russia basically to move beyond this aggressive stance, the sense of messianism, and perhaps probably envision a different course for the country?
I don't know. I think that in the case of that sort of a military defeat, I think a lot of things are possible, but it kind of seems a bit pointless to dwell on it, because that type of military defeat of Russia is not possible if we're talking about parallels with Nazi Germany, because obviously Russia has a lot of nuclear powers. And I think that in my book I sort of make the point that I think we should focus on Ukraine winning, because that's something we being sort of the West can broadly control and have power over, rather than trying to defeat Russia inside, or defeat certain world views within Russia, or regime change of Putin. And realistically, it seems to me that the best way to do this would be, of course, absolutely arm Ukraine to the teeth, get it to a point where it at least takes back some extra territory, as in it doesn't just go back to the 23rd of February borders, but even just a hamlet or something else. And then from that point, really nothing is going to change in Russia at the moment. I think then if we can just, I appreciate this is obviously still a controversial point. This is just, I suppose, from my point of view, what is realistic and could work. Then to focus on a containment policy where absolutely everything is cut off, as in we just cut off ourselves from Russia. We're not trying to contain Russia from anywhere else. We're just trying to contain Russia from the current powers in Russia, from ourselves, from Ukraine. And I would then bring in Ukraine into NATO, just give Ukraine all the deterrence it needs so that it can be safe, and we can just focus on investing in Ukraine, making Ukraine a safe place, making it so that people can return there so that it thrives, and also focus in on ourselves. Because ultimately, even if you just wanted to think, oh, how do we make this better for Russia? And bluntly, I don't think anybody in this room is thinking that, but let's say they were. Well, ultimately, attitudes aren't going to change in Russia until something changes in terms of the available options. We can see that sort of from sociology. And what we need to think about is, right now, our own society is in a complete mess. Let's focus on our own societies, making ourselves resilient to some of these threats, and then eventually that will even be a model. That's ultimately how the Cold War was. There are lots of ways that the Cold War was won, but that's one of the ways. It was just better. People could see it was just better to live in the West. And I think if we can think of a way to kind of revivify our own sort of democracies, and I think that Ukraine's heroism, the heroism of the Ukrainians is a wonderful, it's a tragically wonderful opportunity to maybe reignite that, because we talk all the time about these values, but they don't mean anything, and now they mean something. They mean something in Ukraine. And that could be used as a chance, I suppose, to sort of reassess and restart what it means. But I appreciate it sounds idealistic, especially at a time when we just have all these horrific videos and just an overwhelming amount of tragedy. But it seems like that sort of level of heroism, which I didn't think I'd ever see in my life, that it should mean something and that it should go towards something. But I guess that's for politicians, not for people who sit there doing data analysis of different narratives.
But this is the critical questions, right? The fact that we've spoken a lot about these values that were just empty words, and now Ukraine's fight is actually giving actual meaning to these words and to these values of freedom and sovereignty. I think this is a good opportunity to move towards another discussion that I think should become more and more urgent, and it's about a little bit of soul searching for us in the West. And I think a curious question is, how come that for so long Russian propaganda has been effective in penetrating Western political circles, journalistic circles, academic circles, and in particular, how come that for so long we kept hearing these exaggerations about Ukrainian nationalism and these narratives that portray Ukraine as a deeply divided society, often along linguistic lines, that is a deeply distorting image about how Ukrainian society actually operates, this kind of informal multiculturalism, multilingualism that is very difficult sometimes to understand from a Western perspective. So on the one hand, we had these distorting narratives about the Ukraine, but at the same time, there was no sufficient assessment of actually the threat of Russia's expansionist nationalism. Can you explain like this paradox?
Do you want to have a go?
Okay, well, I feel like I've spoken too much, but well, first of all, I guess I'd check before going into this. I would say it's also always worth checking money and just the general desire to be a bit sort of like an edgelord or sort of a lot of ego in academia sometimes. But if we take those away and look at the more structural problems, I think one of the big issues, and I feel very self-aware as I say this, is that you have a lot of Russianists being asked to comment on Ukraine, and they don't have any training in Ukraine, and they see Ukraine through a Russian lens, and they haven't tried to understand it. So as a result, you have people talking about sort of Ukraine as if it were this state that has a very vertical sort of power base, when actually Ukraine sort of has a much more horizontal approach, just really basic sort of elements. So I think there's that, and also I think there's the fact that a lot of Russianists have a circle of friends that come from a couple of cities that do tend to be opposed to the Russian government. However, that then means that, and they tend to see Russia through quite a Western lens, and so that's familiar and that makes sense, and it's easier to have those conversations. They're not as challenging. However, the issue is that there's an incredible level of what the sociologist Jeremy Morris calls social racism, in that sense of, a really condescending view towards the regions in the two capitals, and but this also affects Ukraine. I think we've seen that, to be honest, in some of the ways that some of the Russian opposition have spoken about Ukraine, and some of their attitudes towards Ukraine is very much of a sense of outrage almost, that Ukrainians are seen as sort of more European than they, the intellectuals of Moscow. And there's that aspect, and there's lots of stories from history that can be drawn out, but this idea that Ukrainians aren't cultured, that Ukrainians aren't maybe as civilized as the Muscovites, that still pervades, unfortunately, and in some opposition circles. Of course, the opposition is incredibly inchoate, so I don't wish to write it all off. But I think that's an important element. So sometimes those views are sort of accepted because you think you're speaking to people who have similar, perhaps more uncritically than they should be. And then very finally, I think sometimes this is specific to the UK. I found it very interesting the extent to which the language question has been something that British people have really struggled with. And I was speaking about it and with somebody, and they were saying, okay, sure, but is it really hard for Russian speakers to learn Ukrainian? And I was like, oh, no. And they're like, okay, but it would be really hard for us to learn Gaelic. It's like, okay, nobody's going to make you learn Gaelic. But, though maybe you might want to, reflect on that a little bit, but fine. My grandparents are Gaelic speakers, Irish Gaelic speakers, so perhaps I have a dog in this fight. However, back to the point. The point is, of course, they're not, but it's interesting the extent to which sometimes, I guess, post-imperial powers stick together. I don't know. I guess they're obviously perhaps ways of thinking about things, or ways of thinking about peripheries that some people in the UK with certain attitudes might just reproduce uncritically, even if they are very, very pro-Ukrainian. And I must say the person who made that comment is very pro-Ukrainian, but was really quite troubled by this language issue.
I mean, there's an interesting emerging body of literature precisely from other former Soviet countries, also Central Asian scholars that try to apply almost a post-colonial lens to post-Soviet studies to basically challenge that predominant Moscow lens through which many studies have tried to approach different aspects of Ukraine over the years. Before my final question, there was just something I wanted to ask Francis that I think it's quite pertinent as a question to our discussion. And we've talked about many narratives that have been dominating in the Russian domestic context, narratives that have been used towards foreign audiences. We talked about these different propagandists. But is there a way for us to actually know whether they believe in all of this, or whether it's just a cynical show? And at the end, does it matter whether they believe in this or not?
Well, I'll start from the end of your question. I don't think it does matter, because a lot of what you see on Russian TV is a performance, and Very occasionally, the fourth wall does shatter. There was a case a few months ago where this presenter, Andrei Norkin, he was talking, this was just after the Russian retreat from Kherson, and he said, well, we've now retreated from Kherson, and I'm not going to tell you what I think about it, because if I say that I support the withdrawal from Kherson, it means I'm questioning Russia's territorial integrity, because we've recognized this as Russian, and if I criticize the retreat, then it means that I'm undermining, I'm discrediting the armed forces. So I don't want to go to jail, so I'm not going to say anything. And this was on state TV, you know, millions of people watching it, and so he's cynical enough to kind of say that to his audience. There are different characters on Russian state TV among the presenters, and some of them don't seem quite as sharp. There's a few new presenters on. I mean, this is a blunt way of putting it, but some of them do seem that they just repeat these tropes over and over again. There's a couple that spring to mind on this. On the show on Channel 1 called Vremya Pokazhet, Time Will Tell, and they're kind of fairly new in the business, and they're not as well established as the likes of Solovyov or Skabeyeva, and I don't know, they do seem almost as if they are sort of brainwashed in a way that they just repeat these trite narratives over and over again. The likes of Solovyov, I mean, this guy had luxury property in Italy on the side of Lake Como, and he must have been thinking, is this worth it at some point? You know, spitting out this hatred every single night, and then in the morning on his radio show. So, I mean, these people are getting paid an awful lot of money. There's been investigation into like their wealth by Alexei Navalny's organization in the last few years, and they obviously have made a calculation that it's worth staying there. I think once the full-scale invasion was launched, you know, there was no way back for them, really. They can't sort of turn around and say we didn't mean it when you're demonizing Ukrainians on a daily basis. So, I mean, I think as it's a performance, and it's infotainment, it's sort of, or agitainment, as Jade said earlier, and that these programs exist to really sort of put Russians in this kind of universe where, well, it's doing lots of things to them. It's sort of persuading them what their country is doing is right. It's also making them apathetic, generally, and kind of doubting. Really, we talk about this kind of postmodernism in Russian propaganda, how it differs from the propaganda used by the Soviet Union. So there wasn't a sense of, in the Soviet Union, you know, they weren't sort of hearing out what the West had said and then laughing at it. They were just pretending that the West wasn't saying anything. Like Chernobyl, when it happened, they just sort of pretended nothing had happened for days or weeks. And now, if you watch Russian TV, they have these sort of 5-minute-long montages of like CNN, BBC, and Sky News, and they're openly telling their audiences what the West is saying, and then they just laugh at it and say, "This is like the West is getting worried," you know, or the West is sort of showing all these Ukrainian losses in Bakhmut, or that kind of thing. So it's sort of. Yeah, I mean that's how it works. I think it's not meant to be sincere. That's the whole point of it.
Would you like to add something?
I just want to add something very quickly to that point, which is about this is a performative cynicism in the sense that you know, there's considerable research to show that it's deliberate. It's done so that people look at it and watch and think, okay, well, I can't trust any of the Western media, which, as you say, it sort of displays, but also even perhaps to a more sophisticated viewer, I clearly can't trust these guys either. And it's, again, remembering that it works on different levels. But what happens if you watch the news and you think that you can't trust it is you then go to sort of your own lived experience, your own things that you feel that you intuitively know in order to make sense of the world and what is happening in the world. And that's where I think, again, this double layer, this second element of popular culture becomes very interesting, because what would you have as an average Russian sort of engaging in mainstream culture? You would have the Great Patriotic War cult. You would have ideas around the 1990s as this terrible time of troubles where the West tried to destroy your country, as it did, at various other points in their history. You would have the idea of internal enemies. You would have the idea of Russia as a besieged fortress, of Russia as a great power whose great victory has been discredited and is being denied, and people are trying to destroy it, by taking down the statues. And that's what you would rely on, and then that would just reinforce and actually pretty much align, if not even better, with some of the things. So even if you may not believe that the Ukrainians crucified a child, you may not believe that there are biolabs in Ukraine that are sponsored by the CIA, but you do think that the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine. You do think that Ukrainians are cruel and they've been brainwashed and overtaken by these extremists, and that you have to save them. So sometimes perhaps this focus on the really crazy elements of the narrative distracts us from the fact that, okay, people probably don't believe them, but what we can see, but they may still believe the undercore message, and they may use those messages to make sense of what their government and what their country is doing to Ukrainians.
I guess we'll postpone the conversations about, what Russian society will look like. Will take time for us to answer certain questions. But I think that, in light of this performative cynicism, as you've called it, I think one of the most extraordinary elements that has come out from the war is even Ukrainians, not just heroism, but also the use of humour as a form of resilience and ability to maintain hope and vision for a future, even when everything around you is destroyed. So I think it would be pertinent to close our wonderful conversation with a question about Ukraine. And particularly as we spoke about all of these narratives that over time have been quite powerful in the West, that have been distorting people's understanding of Ukraine as a society, how it operates, these kind of fictitious images of Ukraine as divided along lines that really did not exist from the lived experience of Ukrainians. Do you think that as a result of the full-scale invasion, we've reached a point of no return, and finally perhaps Ukrainian voice as a political reality, as a cultural reality, will start being perceived as independent and no longer understood through Moscow's lens? Have we reached that point of no return, or is it a bit more complicated?
I don't know if we can say that for every single country, but definitely the impression I have in this country, at least, is that now Ukraine is seen as an independent actor, a country with its own agency. I mean, it's just on a basic level, people realizing that there's like a Ukrainian language, and that they're not just a former province of Russia, which is how I imagine large parts of the British population felt. Just anecdotally speaking to my parents, who had no sort of prior interest in Russia or Ukraine, and sort of realizing why they couldn't say the Ukraine, for example, which is something that people weren't aware of before among the general population. I suppose sentiment is different in other countries, in places where Russia has traditionally had these much stronger business links, for example, and it may take more work to reverse that kind of the notion that they can just simply go back to how it was before once this is over, and continue doing everything over Ukraine's head. But I suppose it was something that time will tell, and Jade will probably have a few ideas on that.
Yes, I have Italian. I can tell you the Italian media landscape is quite challenging. Jade?
I broadly agree with what Francis said. I suppose I would just add, I do feel a bit that we're at a tipping point, and that now people like Alessia, people who are involved, like Maria and Phoebe, who are involved in the Ukrainian Institute, it's such an important role. But I think as well, also for those of us who maybe don't have those direct connections to Ukraine, it's important that we also try to insist that Ukrainian voices are given a space, because even still, it's very frequent. I've had a lot of pushback for asking for Ukrainians to be on panels when I discuss about Russia's war, because they say, well, it's a book about Russia. But it completely changes the whole. I mean, it is a book about Russia, but it's a book about Russia's war on somebody. I think it's important because not because it comes from a bad place, but often what you'll get is just that bureaucratic inertia, say within the civil service or within organisations, that will just want to go back to, first of all, to having conversations with people that they're used to having conversations with, and that's normally a Russianist-dominated space. So I think just, yes, broadly, I think we're definitely in a much better place in terms of, and I agree with what Francis says, but I suppose sort of to be cautious and not let things slip away.
Main takeaway: we need more and more events from the Ukrainian Institute. And on this note, please join me in thanking our panelists, and then we'll have roughly like half an hour for questions. If you could please introduce yourself and keep your questions short and sweet, so we can try and give the floor to as many people as possible. I think Maria will be circulating with the microphone. Yeah, let's start from the extreme. Yeah, right. Yeah, good.
Yeah, thank you all very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I used to be a law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states. I worked extensively in Ukraine, including just before and after the Maidan, for the European Commission stories there. I'm now a broadcaster on the board. I did predict the war was going to happen. My question for all of you, and thank you really for pushing it, particularly Francis's last coded remark about Germany. Country with great Germany, let's be clear, Germany. My question is, given that so many rich Russians live in the West, how can we get the message across to them to perhaps seep a message in to Russian society? And I know you all made the point about the problem of Moscow and St. Petersburg and then the condescension down to the rest of the country. I worked for a Foreign Office anti-disinformation program. We saw how difficult that was. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you happy for me to take questions in groups of 3? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much indeed. Great stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, let's take these 2 gentlemen's questions.
BBC was a huge help to us on that program, I might add.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask you, given how effective the Russian propaganda is, what do you think the response of the Western propaganda and the Ukrainian propaganda should be?
Thank you.
My name is William Blacker. I'm an associate professor in Ukrainian studies at UCL. Thank you to all 3 of you for such a wonderful discussion. My question is about Russian propaganda narratives in Ukraine itself, and particularly in the occupied areas. So obviously Crimea, parts of Donetsk, Luhansk regions have been occupied for about 9 years now. People have been subjected to a large extent, to the same media space as the Russian media space, cut off from the Ukrainian information space in some respects. So I wonder, do you know, what can you tell us about the effectiveness of those narratives in occupied Ukraine? Also, are they somehow modified when they're targeting Ukrainians who they're trying to sort of win over? And also, maybe a difficult question, when these areas are deoccupied, what can the Ukrainian state do to undo the damage?
Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to go first if that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. So in terms of rich Russians, I mean, I don't really see that we have to focus on rich Russians. I think if we have people who are from hostile states whose money cannot be easily proven, they shouldn't be here. But I mean, that's obviously not going to happen. So, I mean, I don't think that we can influence. I don't think that oligarchs as such exist anymore in Russia, and I don't think that we can use them to influence. And I think the idea of using sanctions, I mean, I'm a bit cynical of sanctions in a certain aspect anyway, but I think the idea of using them to have any kind of leverage or influence on Putin through the elites is not possible. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think we should take all of their properties and give it to Ukraine, or work out whatever the legal way is to do that. It's not the issue that I think the sanctions are unfair. It's just we shouldn't be having dealings with these people anyway. Who wants to have dealings with these people? Exactly.
We can make our choice.
Yeah, and who's... Yeah, exactly. That's how I would frame it. In terms of the response of Russian propaganda and of Western propaganda and Ukrainian propaganda. In terms of the Western and Ukrainian response to Russian propaganda, I'm not sure if you mean within Russia, because in that sense, I sort of think that we shouldn't try. I mean, obviously Ukraine is in a different place. If I just speak sort of about the UK, I think often in the UK there's a misunderstanding of quite how much we're disliked. In a lot of Russia, and quite how much we're distrusted. So I would be very cautious. The one thing I would say definitely not to do, because I imagine people will probably try anyway, would be to use kind of fact-checking and disinformation. In that sense of, okay, let's look at the fact-checking. What's these statistics? Because that doesn't work on audiences such as the Russian audience, where they find they already don't really believe that there's such a thing as truth, and therefore they then go back to the sort of things that they intuitively do know, as we've been discussing. So I wouldn't use that approach. And then secondly, in terms of the narratives, I won't pretend, William, that I've had any major focus on these. Of course, I've followed certain Telegram channels, so it's a little bit more anecdotal than sort of an academic research. I mean, in general, the narratives, and I also did look into a research project with a Ukrainian who did focus on this, although it didn't happen. And in general, the narratives, it would appear, sort of are much more intense and terrifying. So definitely fear is playing a much larger role, just because of the sort of really horrific nature of life in the LNR and the DNR. They're not modified in terms of the newly occupied territories. They've not been modified really at all to Ukrainian audiences, I guess reflective of the fact that a lot of the propagandists and a lot of the communications, the people deciding communications strategies do genuinely believe that Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine wanted to be liberated, so that is borne out by the type of narratives. And there's been some interesting kind of conversations within some of the Telegram communities, for example, where you can see you've had kind of new people arrive, i.e. Russians arrive, and then you have sort of people who've lived under Ukraine who are still who are actually pro-Russian in this particular case, of this particular community that I've been looking at, but they have a very Ukrainian way. They expect things to be done, they expect to be able to complain, and someone will do things about it, and then you have the newly arrived people saying, well, just shut up, why are you talking about this, you're causing problems, you're undermining our cause. And so that's been quite interesting, sometimes the dynamics that you see there. But in terms of the deoccupation, that I don't know. I'm going to give up on that one. I mean, I think it's going to be very difficult, but again, a big part of it is going to be about platforming and just making sure that there is that access to Ukrainian space. I mean, the war there does seem to be some research, and perhaps you'll be aware of it too, William, that suggests that, of course, it's very difficult to do sociological research in the DNR and the LNR, but that the war has very much has changed attitudes, not necessarily towards Ukraine, but towards Russia. And so that could be an interesting element. But I think there's going to need to be a lot of research done to understand where that resonance can be built.
Just one thought really on the second question about countering Russian propaganda. I mean, people probably sometimes forget that Russia doesn't exist in the Russian media space doesn't exist in the same way that North Korea or China does. It's not totally blocked off, and as Jade was saying earlier, Telegram is uncensored, and people, millions of Russians have put VPNs on their phones and can access independent media, can access Western media. I think it's just a matter of choice, really, because not that many of them outside of the big cities want to hear what the West has to say. They're not interested, and they're not receptive to any kind of logical arguments about what their country is doing. They're perfectly happy to continue consuming the sort of output of Russian state media. So it's very difficult to sort of say, well, if we start arguing about something in a slightly different way, then it's going to get through to them. I remember one time Boris Johnson actually said something. I think he addressed Russians in Russian. There was like a video, a 30-second video. I can't remember the exact context of it. Can you?
It was early on to say that we know this isn't your war, we know this is just Putin's war. I think there've been follow-up videos, not by him, obviously.
And I remember seeing that on Russian state TV on one of these talk shows, and they played it in full on the show. And then they just laughed at it, and they had this big red stamp sort of overlaid on the video saying fake, as if this was just complete nonsense. So this idea that we can sort of get through to them, even if we make the effort to speak to them in Russian, it's not necessarily, unfortunately, going to work. I mean, I would love to answer the question about the occupied territories, but unfortunately, for better or for worse, that's still done by the Ukraine team in BBC monitoring. So I don't actually really watch that. I mean, I see these officials from Kherson, these Russian sort of appointed officials from Kherson or Zaporizhia regions or the Donbass going on Russian TV a lot. I mean, I think I would just agree with Jade that it's often got this kind of what they say has this sense of desperation because they're very much in the heat of battle that you wouldn't hear from a Russian official elsewhere, and probably is much more emotional, the language as well. But yeah.
I mean, incidentally, Maria and I were involved in a research project with Peter Pomerantsev about media consumption patterns and political attitudes in the occupied areas. And we conducted online focus groups, and what we found out is that many of local residents are actually daily exposed to Russian state media simply because they have been informationally isolated from the rest of Ukraine very early on. But again, the expectation is that indoctrination would be very effective, but this is not really the case. There's a general sense of abandonment from all sides, of tiredness, even annoyance with all the screaming happening on these talk shows. And interestingly, we found out also a sense of escapism, watching different pop culture programs, precisely as what Francis was saying. They are just in a situation of permanent war for years, and so that their situation is slightly different. So yes, exposure to Russian state media, but nonetheless, local attitudes are much more nuanced. Yes, you have a minority that sort of endorse the kind of Russian world narratives, but you have quite a significant proportion of the people that we had focus groups with were, staunch Ukrainian patriots, and very openly spoke about things we didn't expect them to be so open about in these online focus groups. But there's of course a wide proportion of the population that nonetheless feels a bit disillusioned and hopeless. We can't really imagine what it must have been, but that's the insight I can give. Okay,
sorry, can I just come back on one?
Yeah,
I just not to that, but just to Francis's point around the why you can't just sort of turn up and have a better narrative from the West, because you also need to think, what will Russians do with that information? Let's say even that you did convince Russians, well, what are they going to then do with that information now? I mean, how is that helpful? What can they do with it? Of course, they can go and protest, but let's say you're sort of thinking, oh, that does sound quite persuasive, and you think, okay, well, if I choose to believe that, I either have to live in a constant state of cognitive dissonance, which is just incredibly psychologically uncomfortable, or I need to go and, start setting fire to Vayenka, to sort of conscription offices, etc., which people may not want to do for probably quite obvious reasons. I mean, that is a choice, but I think we just need to be realistic that there have been better choices, and until the sort of it isn't just a case of just choosing to believe something else. And on the other side, of course, tempting you away from this narrative is, a view of the world that's very simple, very easy, kind of tells you everything how it is, and that allows you to just get on with your life. And if you're already kind of a poor person who, lives in a place that doesn't maybe have the best roads, and you're on a busy marshrutka after, a job, and you've got loads of loans, you're probably going to do that. So I think as well, sometimes it's not something specific to Russians, it's just how human beings act, for better or worse.
Let's take another round of questions. Yes, the back there, please.
The Oscar to the film about Navalny, is it a far-reaching hand of Russian propaganda, or it's some sort of the message that the Hollywood wanted to deliver to the rest of the world?
Thank you. Let's take some other question from this section. Yeah, on this side, please. I just want to cover all the room. Yes, on the right-hand side, yeah.
Hi, I'm just a PhD student who's just interested, not really a relevant person, but I've got a simple question to ask, so not necessarily related to propaganda or anything like that, but I can see there's a media fatigue on Ukraine quite early on, actually, after the invasion happened, and so this is like happening in the West, so it's like we're seeing a lot less coverage on Ukraine in kind of like media, really, in the UK and also basically in the West, and I'm just wondering whether Russia would see this as an opportunity to insert any kind of like subtle influence over kind of like Western discourse, and whether they are even trying to do that at all, whether they're trying to exploit this kind of vacuum, media vacuum and fatigue that we are seeing on Ukraine right now.
Thank you. Last question was at the back there, please.
Hi, my name is George. I previously did my Master's in War Studies at King's College London. My question kind of relates a bit more on the relationship with China. We see that, prior to Glasnost and Perestroika, China actually, the Sino-Soviet split had happened. But recently we see the development between China and Russia, their relationship has improved significantly. And we see that Russia hasn't really been affected by many of the sanctions. In fact, their economy has grown compared to a lot of the G7 countries. In reality, how has this helped actually shape the narrative within Russia? The fact that China is in some regards, kind of validating and continuing helping them. Continually helping them participate in the international financial system, and what can, I guess, foreign governments like the British government and the Americans really do to kind of prevent Russia's, China's help with helping Russia participate in the international financial system and change the narratives in order to affect Russians more, to change policy within Russia.
Do you think we can fit one more? Yeah?
Yeah.
So first I want to commiserate with Francis, wading through toxic propaganda on a daily basis. But something Jade said I think is fascinating, this idea that someone who thinks of themselves as smart can scrape through the propaganda narratives, and they can say, okay, I can pick the lies from the truth, and they can try and find their own truth. How, Jade especially, but also Francis, how do you go to sources to try and find out what people are thinking? You watch the official propaganda, you try to unpick narratives, but how can we actually get inside people's heads? And I'm thinking of, in particular, a channel called 1420 on YouTube, which sort of interviews people. And there you do get a diverse set of opinions, and you see people turning these propaganda and weaponized historical narratives, and they translate them into their own versions. And it does show quite a diversity there. But I'd love to know what your sources for that are.
Thank you. So one question of how can we read Russians' minds, one on the China factor, one on whether Russia is keen to exploit the observable war fatigue in the media landscape, and one on the Oscar. You can pick whichever one.
Okay, I'll go with the media fatigue question. It's definitely something they pick up on in the Russian state media. They will often make observations about like the number of front pages with Ukraine stories on in the British media or the French media, that kind of thing. And they will often say things like, "Oh, they're getting bored of Ukraine. We just need to keep going," and really sort of stress any kind of, constantly making this link between the cost of living crisis in Western countries and Ukraine, even when the link isn't really there to be made. Looking for any kind of sometimes to the point of absurdity, where there was one example I saw on one of these shows on Russian state TV where there was an article in, I think it was the Daily Mail, talking about people in a restaurant in Britain had started serving squirrels, and it was linked to some kind of environmental initiative about culling grey squirrels so that we could then reintroduce red squirrels back into the UK. And Olga Skarbeva, this host on Russian TV, said, "Oh, they're so poor now in Britain that they're eating squirrels," and it had nothing to do with the cost of living crisis at all. And so there's these kind of pre sort of these narratives that are thought up in advance, and it's where they kind of base what they're anything they say has to fit into one of these pre-established narratives. And I think they're of course they're going to try and exploit it domestically and to tell their audience that basically that they're winning, because if they're still engaged and the West isn't engaged, then for them that can be presented as something positive. I don't know if they can really use that to sort of exploit the West itself, because I think we're so cut off now from like Russian state media with RT and Sputnik being blocked and so on. So. But I think domestically it's definitely something that they're interested in following. I'll have a go at the China question as well. I mean, I don't know about policy because that's not really my area, but they've definitely latched onto this idea that China is an ally, even though there's this no limits partnership is talked up a lot. Sometimes they will say things like, it's just the West and supporting Ukraine, and the rest of the world is with us, even though the rest of the world is broadly neutral. I mean, countries such as India, are they really pro-Russian or are they just pro-themselves? And same with China. I think there was one pundit, occasionally you do hear rare bits of common sense on these shows on Russian TV, and he said, well, we need to stop kidding ourselves. This was when Xi Jinping visited Moscow, about China being behind us the whole time, because actually the only Chinese interests are pro-Chinese interests, and whether they're only going to support us as long as it's in their interests. But I think it's domestically it's useful for them to be able to tell the Russian people that actually it's not the whole world against us. It's just a small number of countries. So they will tell their audience that 51 countries are helping Ukraine, 51 countries are fighting us all on our own when it suits them, when they want to kind of portray themselves as the victims. But when they want to say that actually we're building this multipolar world and breaking free from American hegemony, then they will tell their audiences that they will say things like, you take the 4 strongest countries in the world, Russia, the United States, India and China, it's 3 against 1, with the United States being the one on its own. So I don't know about policy though. I mean, anything I would say on that wouldn't be of much help. So I'll pass over to Jade now, I think.
Thank you. I'll continue on the question to do with China. So, of course, there's a coherence between the types of national identity formation or sort of reformation that have been happening. So you have this big focus on national humiliation at the hands of colonial powers in China, and also, of course, on sort of this recreation of a World War II cult that was previously, or the sort of anti-Japanese war. Of course, it has a different name in China. But this idea that, just, I suppose, the sense that China also the Chinese contribution to World War II has been overlooked, which, to be fair, is completely true, and that this is proof of sort of Chinese heroism and Chinese sort of exceptionalism. Clearly, that correlates very well, and we see a very active memory diplomacy between Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well. However, the issue is that when we get to the national humiliation, we can see, in fact, there was a really interesting article on this just last week about how Chinese censors have been going into overdrive because of course, ordinary Chinese people also see Russia as one of the humiliators and one of those powers. So it doesn't necessarily, the fact that they have similar structures of narrative that are popular and that have resonance actually is not necessarily helpful. So in some ways I wonder if anything needs to be done at all, and whether or not, given the often tempestuous relations between China and Russia, this will just fall apart sort of on its own, and we won't just make things worse by trying to engineer a split. And then in terms of the Navalny comment, I mean, I don't think it's Russian propaganda, just in the sense that it's been so terrible for his, the movement, the way the movement is seen in Russia since the kind of more, clearly Western-centered rebranding that's happened of the entire sort of FBK Anti-Corruption Foundation movement. It's been very damaging, and of course it didn't really help when Volkov was lobbying for an oligarch who is one of the owners of the largest private bank in Russia and who has never condemned the war. And I think the Oscars and the pictures, the way they were used in the media, and Francis, you can tell me if you saw anything different, but it seemed to me that it was very much sort of where they were even commented on at all. It was, well, look how out of touch, they're kind of part of the sort of Western elite, and so I don't think it helped. In terms of how to understand, this is an important question that all of us, Jonathan's question, about how to assess kind of reception. It's always been tricky. It's especially going to be tricky now. If previously you could have sort of focus groups, or you could have, you could rely on sociological data unproblematically. Now that's not the case because of the issues. There are always some issues with trusting what people say, who completely tells the truth in public as opposed to what they think. So there are always some issues, and we shouldn't overstate them. But I think for me, one of the areas that I found more helpful is, I suppose, what's called ethnography. So that's kind of embedding within different online communities and just sort of watching how the views and reactions change among different kind of constituencies that I find interesting, whether or not that's sort of mothers and wives of the mobilized, or whether or not that's people in Mariupol, and so on. And then the other way I would suggest is looking at sort of what people are watching in terms of TV ratings, and also in terms of virality, in terms of which narratives are getting the most viewer engagement, and sort of taking that longer term, a longer view of which sort of narratives are appealing the most in terms of being reproduced the most. Of course, you can't get too specific, because then you have to say, okay, what about if there's bots? What about this? What about that? And there are always limitations, but I find that kind of observer stance is perhaps probably methodologically going to be certainly going to be the way that I'm going to sort of go forward.
Like another round, quick round?
I think we should probably finish
it. All right, for those of you who didn't get a chance to ask questions, I'm sorry, but as always, there's never enough time to ask questions to such fantastic speakers. So thank you for your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists, Jade and Francis.
Part of the reason for finishing now is that we're not going to have so long for our drinks reception this evening. It can only last until 8:30, so please do stay for that. And there is a small chance to speak more with Jade and Francis and Jaroslava. And I'd like to say another big thank you to the European Parliament Liaison Office for hosting us tonight, And a big, big thank you to our panel. And I would also like to invite you to our next event with Ukrainian Institute London. It will be next Wednesday. One of the points that Jade brought up earlier was about how being supportive of Ukraine doesn't necessarily mean that we in the UK understand all that much about Ukrainian history and identity. And next Wednesday we will be hosting a Ukrainian-Canadian historian, Professor Paul Robert Magorczy, who will be in conversation with Dr. Mani Howlett about the history and development of Ukrainian identity and nationhood and statehood. So please do join us for that. On these sheets you have the Twitter handles for our speakers. I highly recommend the Twitter feed of both Jade and Francis and Jaroslava too. And you can follow us at Ukrainian Institute London and also follow the Liaison office here and their important work. Thank you all very, very much for coming.